Kia ora. This is G-REG, the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, and I'm Ian Caplin. And some of you may remember many years ago the 3 R's of education, as they were called, reading, writing, and arithmetic. The phrase was said to embody the fundamentals of education, but it rather fell over as an acronym. My guest today will be extremely well qualified to agree with me on that point, I think, because she is the president of the British Academy and also Professor of Law at the London School of Economics, Professor Julia Black, CBE. Kia ora, Julia, and welcome. We'll come to Julia in just a minute. It's just worth mentioning, I think, first of all, that it's a sort of a celebratory broadcast, in the sense that it's the 15-year anniversary of really responsive regulation. 3 R's, an acronym that works and that is spelt correctly, co-created with Robert Baldwin. And that's what we're here to talk about. Professor Black has a wide range of international credits and accolades. Locally here in New Zealand, in relation to Victoria University of Wellington, the Sir Frank Holmes Visiting Professor, formerly in public policy. Julia's written extensively in a number of areas on regulatory issues, advised around the planet policymakers, governments, consumer bodies and regulators, both on institutional design and regulatory policy. We're absolutely delighted that Julia joins G-REG. Julia, kia ora, and a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. Can I just start by looking at the 15-year anniversary? I think my wife tells me it's a crystal anniversary. When it comes to really responsive regulation, if I can call it triple R, how do you think the take-up's been around the planet? Would you say it's, every pun intended, crystal clear, or in some cases perhaps through a glass darkly?
To be honest, I think that one of the challenges as an academic is you never really know actually how your work's been used. Of course, I would love to be able to say, oh, everybody signed up to it and it's clearly there for everybody to see, but the answer is you never really know. Because for a number of different reasons. Policymakers aren't always brilliant at attributing anything they do or come up with to anybody else. But secondly, because it tends to morph into and merge with their existing strategies, their existing thoughts, their existing policies, etc. And so it might have influenced, I'd like to say, it might have influenced various people to think differently about regulation. But it's actually quite hard to tell, really, how what impact your work has. You sort of throw it out there and hope it resonates and hope it comes back to you. And sometimes that can take a while as well, because it depends on different fashions and what's in favour at different times. So, I like to think that it has a positive influence, but I couldn't actually turn around to you and say, well, actually, the following list of regulators have signed up to this, in anger, as it were, or in joy, and definitely using it in a really thorough way. So,
yeah, I mean, I guess in the absence of a subscriber list, though, let's perhaps think about what the universe was like effectively before triple R, when it was double R, just to get the audience sort of completely universally up to speed. What was kind of a landscape of thinking before really responsive regulation?
So, I mean, it's quite challenging now. It's always difficult to sort of cast your mind back, isn't it, to what were we all thinking? When in that stage of regulatory debate, because the study of regulation is pretty new, in the sense that it's probably a couple of decades old now. But you had, I remember when I was researching for my PhD, which was in the early 90s, regulation really wasn't a thing, and you had some economic literature on kind of rate of return regulation in airlines and railroads and things like that, and you had a bit on kind of US regulators and kind of New Deal regulatory agencies. And then the thing which really stormed into the firmament was the Ayres and Braithwaite responsive regulation, but that was entirely focused on very well, but on enforcement, and it was that the relationship between the regulator and the regulated. And we know how that pans out, and it's very good. You start you start at the bottom of the ladder and you kind of work your way up, using a sort of tit for tat strategy along the way. But as well as, so that was good, and that kind of played into a whole stream of regulatory literature at the time, which was coming out of policing and criminology, which is about kind of street level bureaucrats and looking at another bunch of street level bureaucrats enforcing another bunch of law and how are they going about doing it. And then on the another side of the space, you had kind of the administrative lawyers thinking about, oh, we've got these new things, regulatory agencies, and it's all about discretion and accountability. And you started, and what they were starting to do was sort of map the fact that actually there are a lot of them about. And so the sort of regulatory space literature, there's the regulatory space and everybody's working around. So I think what we were doing, and then you started to get literature as we were sort of coming through that starts to look more about the dynamics and how this is working and how regulators are choosing different strategies, and it's not just about enforcement, and there's policy making, and it's quite a complicated picture. And so you start to get that increased complexity. And so what we were really doing in really responsive regulation was to say, well, listen, if you've got a regulator and you're sitting in the middle of all of this, you've got a lot of different things that you are responding to. One of those things is absolutely your relationship with the regulatee, and that's where the responsive regulation bit comes in. But the play on the words, and it's nothing good like a good acronym. Be really responsive. You can't just be responding in that dyadic relationship, regulator or regulatee. You've got to be responding to all these other things as well. You've got accountability concerns, you've got resource constraints, you've got different incentives, you've got different players in the market. And so what you need to think about if you want to understand how regulators are behaving, and if regulators are also themselves thinking about how they need to behave, is just understand that much wider context.
And that wasn't it, Julia, novel and groundbreaking? Because that was a world 15 years plus ago of still, if you like, the dyadic, the bilateral regulations, the coercive power of the state. We're us and you're you, the regulated party, and the extrinsic stuff didn't really bite at all, or if it did, it was secondary. Is that a fair comment?
Obviously, it was groundbreaking. I think, to be fair, we still are really trying to map out and work out those dynamics in this ever constantly shifting space. And, we talked about, to be really responsive, you've got to be responsive not just to, your regulatee, but not how they're responding, but also thinking about the firm itself, how it's... And there's something there, not only what we're trying to get at there is not just its capacity to implement and its incentives, but how it sees the world and how it sees the problem. And that's an area of sort of that kind of cognitive element is something I've pulled out subsequently and sort of enhanced in my own kind of thinking as my thinking has evolved. And then to thinking about that institutional environment of the regulatory regime that picked up some of the regulatory space stuff, in the sense that there's just lots of other players out there. And then in my own work, I sort of pulled that thread in work that I did with others, looking at the interaction of transnational regulatory regimes, for example, to look at those different dynamics, but also to looking at the logics of the regulatory tools and strategies and how the assumptions on which they're based, the assumptions that have to prevail and the conditions that need to prevail if they're to work. And that thread I really focused on post-crisis, when we saw in financial regulation, we'll probably come back to this, all the kind of the things that the fashion at the time was saying, these are really good regulatory strategies because they play into, management-based regulation and, playing into the incentives that are regulatee, and you can kind of, and therefore you'll get successive regulation. And we tried all of those and they all completely failed after crisis. So, so that was a really good wake-up call. So I kind of pulled that thread on kind of tools and strategies after that, we really need to think hard about this because we've misunderstood something here. And then bring all of that back together to think about, well, how is all of this working out in terms of the overall performance of the regulatory regime, and where are the feedback loops to enable the system to evolve and change? And how does that information flow? And then who's got the levers to change? Because the regulator doesn't necessarily have those levers. So it's it's I suppose you could argue, the critics would say, well, it's kind of, relishing in complexity and nobody can ever possibly do all of this stuff. And that was one of the criticisms that came out, which was, well, it's just an impossible task for regulators to do this, to which our response is, yeah, but they have to. It's the job.
Yes, and it makes me think, Julia, because it's going to be one of my questions a bit later. I'll bring it forward if I may. It's how do regulators, do you have any case studies or thoughts or both on how regulators actually execute this, in the sense of they get cognitively the 5 cardinal points of triple R, they understand it, they appreciate that it should be executed. Next level, how do you actually, run it to ground? Any kind of thoughts, or have you seen it happen somewhere particularly?
Well, I think it goes back to the point, is anybody using this as a kind of a matrix and a framework? And I'm not sure anybody really is, to be honest. I like to flatter myself to say that they actually are. But so it's more to I suppose my observations are more about, well, how are regulators really trying to work their way through these issues in practice? And one of the things that I would kind of play into this as well, and make more of, which we did in the really responsive risk-based regulation stuff, is the importance of the regulator's own dynamics.
Yes.
In a much more fine-grained sense than might have been thought about, prior in the early days of regulatory literature, when you're just trying to do everything. So, and what we were really, when you start looking at within regulators themselves, and I got incredibly interested in terms of, well, how are they themselves organising themselves to perform this really difficult set of tasks and functions? How are they prioritising? So you've got a mandate there, but when you go down from that, you've got to operationalise that. So what does that look like? And how are they allocating their resources, and how are they therefore responding in different ways to these different pressures, and identifying what for them is a risk, and they should focus on what is a lesser risk that they can't ignore, but they still need to be able to manage in some way. And then thinking that through in terms of really thinking about how regulators, can make those choices more explicit, and seeing how some of them increasingly now do. So, and again, another trend in regulation, as it were, and kind of the self-consciousness and self-awareness now of regulators, as regulation becomes a profession. People move between regulators.
And G-REG, of course, has something to say about the professionalisation of the regulatory workforce. And one of the points that you make, Julia, is I think implicitly about the regulatory culture, or at least the institutional culture. We'll come to that. I'm just going to turn to the 5 cardinal points that really add the extra R, I think, in your literature to make responsive regulation really responsive. And they are the regulated parties' operating and cognitive frameworks, their attitudinal settings, the broader institutional environment of the regulatory regime, the different logics of regulatory tools and strategies, the regime's own performance, and changes in each of these elements. We're going to take a quick look at each of these 5 in turn. And the first one is attitude, the regulated parties' operating and cognitive frameworks, their attitudinal settings. And I think we've touched on this already, Julia. I know you mentioned when you gave the lecture in Wellington that on which touched and concerned regulatory disasters, the need for regulators be really, really highly attuned to the history and the very extrinsic circumstances of those that they regulated, perhaps much more widely than was previously thought.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and in fact, the work that I did when I was in Wellington, actually, on regulatory disasters, really helped me evolve my thinking as well, from the really responsive into the sort of the elements that I've really pulled out now for thinking about the dynamics of the regulatory system. There's nothing like watching things go wrong to really be able to work that, sort of pin that down. So, but focusing on the organisational side of it, for the firms, And I think, we always knew there was a the framework of the well-intentioned, well-informed, ill-intentioned, ill-informed, etc. And what I had worked on much earlier, back in the early 2000s, was the notion of regulatory capacity. And so this was to do with the capacity both of regulators to regulate in terms of their organizational processes, resources, etc. But you can flip it into the capacity of a regulated firm to actually comply. And that's going to be a combination of three different things: their organizational resources, their financial resources, their organizational resources in terms of their abilities to, process, distill the regulation into some kind of internal mode of compliance, etc. And then whether or not they actually give a damn. Okay, so whether or not they're actually interested in complying, or whether or not actually they're just going to go and do what they want, and a fine is just a cost of doing business, right? It's just another cost on the P&L. Now, there's nothing, I can't quite remember actually going back, but that was definitely around. That was definitely a core part of responsive regulation, and a core part of the two R's, as it were. Was also the fact that organisations aren't a single thing; they're quite heterogeneous, and so you'll have some bits of the organisation which will be responding in some way, and other bits that will be responding in different ways. And what will be happening at board level might be very different from what's happening on the ground. The board may or may not be aware of that. But I think, if you tie that in also to the work, there was a lot of work that's been done on self-regulation, then that work look very closely at the dynamics of, well, what does it take to get an organisation to act in a certain way and comply with a set of rules, and thinking about that whole series of dynamics. And we know that there was evolving from that, regulators starting to think about that, and to be thinking perhaps a little bit more strategically about how they are going to respond to new entrants who would be clueless largely, so we need more educated, those who are just your complete recalcitrants who are never going to comply, and those that you could work with, etc. So there was obviously sophistication and nuance coming in, and a lot of this, to be honest, is kind of writing up common sense. To be frank, there's no magic to it. So it was, but I think that it wasn't that hadn't been drawn attention to. Obviously, it had been, but for us, it was just it wasn't the thing you needed to pay attention to. It was just one of the many you needed to pay attention to.
Yes, and I think it's interesting because our next piece is the broader institutional environment of the regulatory regime, number 2, as it were, of the 5. And I think we've touched on quite a bit of that. And one of the things that both expressly and implicitly, Julie, I think you pointed to, was the culture of the regulator itself. Look to yourself. How much is culture? I think we're more focused on it these days. In your mind, how much is culture really relevant to making Triple R work really well?
Oh, listen, it's critical, right? It's absolutely critical. So on the firm side, it's not all about culture. You can have a wonderful culture and useless processes, but that's just that can happen. But on the regulator side, then culture defines in a way what kind of regulatory approach you'd be successful in adopting. So this is where it links in with kind of different tools and strategies, for example. So a culture whereby if you're using a regulatory strategy which is more principles based or outcomes focused or judgment based or any of those those terms, as opposed to, and these are stylized, but they still do exist, as opposed to one which is much more focused on legal compliance, etc. Then you do require different skills and skills from your supervisors or your regulators, as well as your firms, and it does require a different type of culture within the regulator, because if you've got a sort of a process which says, well, actually we're looking for compliance with everything, And when we go back to a firm, we are very happy to send them back a list of here are a number of 57 things that you need to do in order to correct what's gone wrong on our last inspection. And we've inspected against a kind of a clipboard approach. So, and you see this in different across countries in different regulators. Then that's quite a different culture from a regulator who says, right, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the firm and we're going to restrict ourselves to 5 or 6 really big things we want them to fix. And those 5 or 6 things are going to be focusing on their systems and controls. They're going to be focusing on their sort of really high level things. And yeah, there may well be a tail of, 57 other little minor things, but actually we're doing a much more root cause analysis, and that's what we're going to focus on. Then
Yes.
you're asking your supervisor to do something completely different, right? Which means you also have to be trusting your supervisors or your enforcement people to actually be able to make those judgments, to have different types of conversations, to make different types of evaluations, take a bit of risk actually in that process. So you need therefore a culture which is going to be supportive of your regulators acting in that way, having that capacity to make those judgments, having that capacity. And if you're on a risk-based system, then to make that work, you have to have a culture whereby if the prioritization decision has been actually, we're not going to be focusing our enforcement resources, our inspection resources or supervision on this group over here, and something goes wrong, well, do you know what? That's fine. We can deal with that. We're not going to punish you. We're not going to dock your salary. It's not a black mark for your promotion criteria. You're following the prioritization decision. We knew that might be a consequence and we're happy to take it. It's very, you need a very specific culture to reinforce the type of regulatory strategy that you're trying to use.
Yeah, and I think that beautifully, if I may say so, takes up the tools and strategies point in terms of implementing a plan. How do you actually do it? What do you select, and what do you deselect? Number 4 is the regime's own performance. And I think in the past you've described all of these sort of dealings and dealers as a multitude of actors in a regulatory regime, presumably with things like AI that you've written about most recently, and that readers in 2008 wouldn't have thought about in the same way, if at all. How's the cast changed these days?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Well, you potentially got AI as an actor. That's something we're all coming to get into terms with, and trying to get to terms with. I think I'm very focused. We've also had people like Lessig rightly talking out in terms of code, the role of code and operational code, and in as being an actor in itself. We've got a lot more focus on from the science and technology gang, as it were, that come in looking at models and model construction. And so moving away from seeing regulation as a bunch of rules written down using text, and therefore thinking about interpretation in those of a rule as being a largely textual activity, to really thinking hard about the role of might be computer code, or it might be models, calculative models, and those merge in AI. So you've got and now we've got the in a way AI is a new actor, and that's something we're all going to come to terms with. But I think what we've also sort of realizing in the AI space is the other thing you've got to, if you're a regulator, you've really got to understand, you've got to understand the business. Okay, that's fine. That's fairly straightforward. You've got to understand the business models, and you've got to understand the product. If they're making products and you're interested in regulating that product and how that product is made so that it can be safe in the way that it's used. Okay. So what we've got in the case of AI is actually we've got highly emergent business models coming out of generative AI. Nobody really quite knows yet how they're going to monetize this, but they're trying damn hard, right? Sure. We know from the experience with big tech and social media that it's all about the business model, and new business models will be emerging. but we don't quite know what those are yet. And also we've got a really complicated product, which is made of lots of different components, but which is made unusually from a regulatory point of view in quite a distributed way.
Yeah.
So now we have parallels of this coming in, obviously, from the internet. So we've got sort of parallels there in terms of internet protocols and interactivity, etc. But what we've got in AI is you've got a layered product, as it were, where you've got kind of open source, and then you've got apps being built on that, and then you've got products and services being delivered on that. So trying to work out where's your warm body. As a regulator, you want to wrap your arms around a warm body, right?
Yeah.
To call them to account. Okay, it might be a company, but there's a warm body in there. But what if you've got a decentralized autonomous organization on a blockchain, or you've got open source data which is being kind of put in? How's this product being built? What's the business models? And thinking therefore from a regulatory point of view, this is a whole new industry which is growing at space, which is highly technologically complicated, and moreover, where you've got a little bit of a regulatory competition race going on between the big regional blocks, and you've got issues which go well beyond welfare economics in terms of how we think about the appropriate regulation of AI in different spaces. So it's great from an intellectual point of view. It's hugely exciting. It's slightly scary from a societal point of view, for sure. Lots of opportunities, but obviously lots of risks as well. So
yes, and I think coercing and educating or educating a hologram is slightly tricky in the absence of a warm body, or at least another legal person like a company. And I guess change, which is number 5, is really something that includes AI as an ingredient, but also I think previously you've written that the kind of classic, we love our pyramids, but the kind of classic pyramidal structure doesn't necessarily incorporate an assessment mechanism to react to or determine change, and every pun intended here. With the AI and other environments of change, how out of shape might you say that the pyramidal model is?
Well, as I say, the pyramidal model is fantastic for what it does, which is look at that dyadic regulator-regulatory relationship in a context where you've got a regulatory system in place, and you've got a bunch of rules, and you want people to comply with them in a way which achieves the regulatory outcome. And what we have in the AI space is that actually we're trying to form those regulatory rules. Okay, the EU has got first mover advantage in that with the AI Act. We're trying to identify who the regulatees might be, trying to work out how to organise our own regulatory furniture, as it were, to be the regulators for those who are producing products or services which incorporate or use AI in certain ways. And so you've got a kind of the system which is in that very interesting formative stage, and you've got different approaches which are being adopted. So in financial regulation, for example, we've always had how do you organize the regulatory furniture? Do you by function? So it's a bank, it's a security, it's some kind of financial product, and you organize insurance, and you organize your regulators on those lines, or do you organize them by shoving everything into one thing, or do you do the kind of the Australian Twin Peaks, which we've obviously adopted in the UK, and you do it by kind of mission and purpose? And there are pros and cons for each one of those. So, for AI, the similar thing is coming out. Well, how do you organize yourself as a state to regulate AI? Do you do the one big regulator, or in the UK, we've got the debate at the moment of just saying, well, actually, every regulator that already exists, just do the AI regulation as it comes into their patch, and we'll have some sort of loose coordinating thing in the middle.
Yes.
Which is fine, but doesn't really work either, because you might have new risks which are in markets which aren't currently regulated. And, so there are lots of pros and cons. So, the regulated pyramid doesn't tell you how to organize your regulatory furniture, right?
No.
Set yourself institutionally, and nor does it help you with the diagnostics of okay, now I'm creating a regulatory regime. Actually, who is it I want to make responsible for what?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
at what stage? So it works in an existing setup.
Yeah.
And moreover, it works when you've only got one regulator regulating that company. But if you've got anything more complicated or a different question, then it doesn't answer, it answers that question of, I am a regulator, I have a bunch of firms, I need to get them to comply. What's the best way I'm going to do that? And it's great at answering that question, but it doesn't answer the question of how do I design an entire regulatory regime and regulatory system? And how do I diagnose when actually my regulatory system isn't working? And it's not necessarily because of non-compliance, but because it just doesn't fit, or it doesn't fit with the market, it doesn't fit with the technology, or it was based on the wrong assumptions, or some other reason why it's failing.
Yeah, and I guess Triple R plays in very nicely in that sense in terms of describability to concepts of regulatory system and regulatory stewardship within it, and the coordinated and kind of overarching commonalities between regulators, regulated parties, and other regulators and other actors. Triple R and regulatory stewardship, a slightly different acronym on RS, but what would you say the relationship between those two could be, and how could it be better honed?
I'm going to come back to it, as a regulator, stewarding your regulatees, as it were, is one very important part of your job. And responsive regulation, which basically says, think about how you use your sanctions, start small, move up the ladder, think about tip for tat strategy, takes you an awfully long way in thinking about how you manage your regulated population. But what it doesn't do is, first of all, tell you or help you decide, actually, you've got finite resources, how you're going to prioritize the different resources across those different firms. So it doesn't speak to risk-based regulation, for example. It's focusing only one part of the regulatory function. And moreover, it pays no attention at all to the other pressures that a regulator may be under, which might be coming from their political overseers, or might be coming from kind of public pressure, it might be coming from different stakeholders. And so, there'd be one bunch of critique which it, takes no account of regulatory capture, for example. Or you've got, in terms of different relational distances, which might build that old relationships, as it were, in that very narrow space. It takes no account of the incentives that regulators themselves are under. So one report, going to my disasters, the Wellington disaster, no, they weren't because of Wellington, but is the one place I always tell people to go and look at is to look at the report on Deepwater Horizon. Remember back when the Deepwater Horizon, the oil spill? So it's a congressional inquiry into the Minerals Management Inspectorate, as was.
Yeah.
So which found that that body had two jobs. It was to issue licenses for deep sea drilling, and it was to perform the environmental assessments. And the way the regulation was designed, it was very, very technical, very detailed, and focused on a particular technology that, at the time the legislation was written, was being used for deep sea drilling. Well, there were a number of problems leaving aside personal relationships that were going on within, honestly, whether you can make it up.
But that's a culture point, isn't it, Julie? I mean, that's highly material as well.
That is a culture point. That is a culture point. So first of all, the technology had moved on. So nobody was using the technology that was anticipated in the legislation. So actually the enforcers had very little to enforce against, and Congress had refused to change the legislation. So this is about the dynamics of the system. Things have moved on. Congress had the lever to make the changes. Congress refused to make the changes. In terms of how the agency's performance was assessed, it was assessed in terms of the number of licenses that it issued and the amount of royalties that it brought in from those licenses. Now, surprise, surprise, when it's doing its environmental assessment, it will be no surprise to find that actually, amazingly enough, those environmental assessments often ended up with it's okay to drill. And yes, we'll take your money. So, and again, that's a cultural point. You could have had an agency that just resisted that and chose to kind of withstand that pressure that was coming down from Congress. But it takes quite a brave agency to continue to do that, because ultimately, the ultimate sanction for a regulator is just to be shut down. And that happens, right?
Yes.
Regulators get shut down.
Absolutely.
You do have that wider kind of environment. So the responsive regulation is great when it's looking at, the inspectorate vis-a-vis, an oil driller. But actually, if you take into account this wider context of the pressures the regulator themselves is under, the expectations they're under from their own accountability overseers, as it were, their own regulators who regulate the regulators, then you've got to play all of that into really understanding the dynamics of the regime as a whole.
Yeah, and I guess the flip also is, nowadays potentially, who's watching the watch people, it's the climate change mandate effectively. So for all the pressure to get licenses in previously, it could be that other administrations are under pressure to do a good thing, which is to protect the climate, but perhaps it's a resource-based issue or something else. I mean, where it kind of leads potentially looking around the world, I guess, is where Triple R has had uptake, and I appreciate they haven't all written in, but I'm sure it's had uptake. I mean, it's certainly had uptake here. That's why I made contact with you, Julie, if I may say so. But how does it? And I think that we've dealt with the question about the difference that it makes. How does it hold up conceptually and practically as a doctrine under stress?
So as I say, the really thought-provoking moment for me, should we say, it's a massive understatement, was a global financial crisis, right? Because as it was for a lot of people, and clearly, obviously, I work in financial service regulation, so that's the one I was closest to. But it prompted a refinement of a number of different elements of really responsive regulation into which worked then their way through the disasters piece that I wrote that you referenced when I was out in Wellington, and that itself evolved into a kind of which when I wrote the AI piece that you referenced, I got a sort of elements there of a regulatory system, and they kind of draw on the really responsive, and that is because it's about looking at a system in stress. Now, I go back to the point that really what I was trying to do, or Rob and I were trying to do in really responsive regulation, and what I'm doing in the way I sort of frame the different elements of a regulatory system as my thinking has evolved, is actually this is not a normative proposition. So the way to sort of evolve RRR is into the elements of a regulatory system is to sort of start off with goals and values. Okay, so what's trying to achieve. Then what really struck me in the global financial crisis was the importance of that kind of cognitive framing. How are the people understanding the world? And that's how the regulators understanding the world, as well as the regulatees. Because what was really clear in the financial crisis was that actually regulators had built, or policymakers had built, this edifice of financial regulation. And this is at the global level as well. Had built this edifice of financial regulation on a bunch of economic theories, really, around kind of neoclassical economics, but also that the market will correct itself, and firms would have considerable incentives not to bankrupt themselves, etc., etc., etc. And it just didn't play out like that. Markets just didn't work in the way that they were. That the dominant economic theories, which had been picked up by regulators and incorporated into their regulatory frameworks, the assumptions on what they've been based, proved to be false and incorrect. And now it wasn't that there weren't other economists out there that were predicting this. There were, but they just weren't picked up. Interesting question in itself. So I was very struck. So I was at the NSC time. The Queen came along. I must have told this story. to open a new building. It was just October 2008. What timing was that? And she rightly said to our leading economists, obviously I've been a lawyer up on the balcony, not nearly important enough meter. And she said, well, why did nobody see this coming? And so they all went away and went, So they scratched their heads and they wrote a letter actually from the British Academy. And they said, sort of rambled on a bit. But the most important sentence for me was, actually, we didn't see it coming, and that was due to a collective failure of imagination.
Wow. I mean, it's interesting.
So that was really, really interesting. Yeah. So that's why when I'm talking about the AI, it's actually, well, how are we really understanding the world, the market, the product, the theories? What's the cognitive assumptions on which policymakers' regulation is being based? And do we have a sort of cognitive capture, kind of a group think, as it were, in the policy elite, which is actually the world is going to work in this way. Financial markets, there will be certain correlations, but it might be in relation to climate. It doesn't matter what it is, but the world is going to work in this certain way. And that's the way we're going to base our regulation. And it may be assumptions about how firms are going to behave. It might be about markets. It might be about, scientific and the way the, climate is going to evolve, etc. So that for me, I sort of drew that out as in RR, but kind of brought it out to be actually this in itself is really important. And bringing that together with what sources of knowledge are we drawing on in order to make those assessments. And I think, thinking about it, we could see that in COVID as well. So the early stages of COVID, we think right back to, sort of January 2020. And I call this the duck rabbit problem. If you sort of Google duck rabbit, this is an illusion, right? And you sort of see the drawing, and some people see a duck and some people see a rabbit. Now, that early data coming out was the same. Everybody saw the same data when it started to come out. But if you're in the Southeast Asians looked at it and thought, looks like a respiratory disease, looks like SARS. Why? Because they're very used to SARS, availability heuristic. It's SARS. It's like that, so they kind of prep for that. Come over to the UK, possibly other bits of Europe, but I know the UK, and we're prepped for flu, right? We get a lot of flu.
Yeah.
And so the same data was interpreted as, it's a type of flu. So we need to prep for that.
Yes.
So you've got just different, you've actually here got the same data, but you've got different kind of cognitive assumptions, and that takes you in different directions. So, and we know from the risk literature as well that actually the sources of knowledge you draw on, and within policy elites, and particularly I think there's an issue as well when you've got sort of science base coming in. For scientists, only certain types of knowledge is valid. So only, for example, if you've done randomized control trials, or if you're in medicine, you've done lots of different, etc. Whereas actually for a social scientist, actually it's much about observation. It's about, and so the early days about masks, for example, should they be worn, should they not? We haven't done an RCT on mask wearing. No, God damn it, that we're in a pandemic, so why not just get people to wear them?
Would be helpful. So, yes.
And different sources of knowledge are seen as acceptable, unacceptable. So that for me, the crisis. So did it work under stress? Did the framework work under stress? I say it's not a normative framework, but did that certainly that sort of stressing, those are pretty big stresses, has really prompted me to think actually that cognitive framework, this how you think about the world, and therefore the sources of knowledge you draw on and what knowledge you seem to be relevant and valid and what you don't, is actually really fundamental importance to the design, functioning and operation of the regulatory system.
And I think, and thank you for that, Jude. I mean, I think it makes me think about innovation, and certainly the drivers for economists within government. I mean, it's mandated at OECD level effectively. I don't see the parallel track of mandatory innovation necessarily for regulators. And I was watching a Malcolm Sparrow lecture the other day, and I'm sure he'll forgive me if I've misparaphrased him, but I think he was effectively saying that innovation was a euphemism for when the normal kind of tricks don't work. Do you think that there should be some sort of mandatory form of innovation at that kind of international governance, OECD type level, just to really get it more into the regulatory bloodstream rather than leaving everyone to pick it up for themselves?
In terms of regulatory innovation?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's one of those things, you see, so first of all, I think regulators do innovate, actually. And innovation
Yes.
is innovation when other things don't work. Well, yes, it is, because otherwise you don't have innovation. So that's not a really profound point. So what is innovation? You mentioned new products and services, new ways of doing things. So it's better, faster, cheaper, quicker. Um, and that's because the old ways aren't so great. So that's kind of the definition. Um, but the process itself, I think, of um, you know, well, a couple of things. One about a regulatory innovative process. First of all, it does. There is a cultural element to that. So because there's a risk taking element to it, it might not work. Um, the kind of mantra of move fast and break things, well, doesn't really work in a regulatory environment. You don't want to necessarily go out and break stuff. And so you might need to think about different ways. But I think what has been quite interesting in the last few years are ways of, creating controlled environments, basically, where you can experiment, or you can experiment with new businesses coming in. So the regulatory sandbox idea, which the FCA piloted probably, when did they do that? Probably about 10 years ago now. 10 years doesn't take you back nearly as far as it used to, I find. So as we all get a bit older. And I think this is a really, that innovation, for example, I think has proved to be very useful, obviously widely adopted, widely copied, and rightly so, for trying to test out and for regulators to understand how new technological innovations based on new technologies, new products and services, including AI, will actually work and function in the real world. And so you can try them offline, you can try them off grid. You get firms who are, to be honest, really not interested in being regulated and have no culture of being regulated, and moreover might come with an ideology that actually they're far too important for the state to interfere in them.
Yes.
Coming into a regulated environment, going, oh right, okay, so I need to have governance, I need to have some risk management, and that's all sounds very tedious. And regulators going, yeah, but actually this is the grown-up world now, so you've got to be a bit of a grown-up.
Join.
But also learning. So there's a cultural piece to go on there, but there's also actually just learning about the technologies and the products and the services. So I think there's innovation in that space, but I think there's also, it does go to culture. It does go to a kind of political risk. Politicians are prepared to see regulators innovate. They're interested in helping them innovate. How are we going to contain that? It might not always work. It might go wrong. But also, I think the thing to remember for regulators innovating, it is a particular form of entrepreneurship. So it happens to happen within the organisation.
Yes.
And it's different. So there is then a whole dynamic. You can't be an outsider and an upstart and then come on into the regulatory space and say, oh, listen, I'm much better than everybody else. It's like, actually, well, no, do you have a statutory mandate? No, I don't think so. And so you're promoting innovation within an organisation, and that's a particular dynamic within itself. And there's a lot of literature out there on how difficult that is to do.
Yes.
Because you've got to create, often a sort of separate unit that's given a license to go and experiment, but then you've got to reintegrate their experiment into the kind of the mainstream. So it's as one said, it's kind of when the beanbags meet the suits. Do you know what I mean? Everybody's been sitting around. Okay, it's a pre-COVID reference. It's a very sort of 80s reference when people worried about wearing suits, but you see what I mean? You've been kicking around in your ping pong table and all the rest of it, and it's been fantastic. And then you've got to move into a world of well, actually, there's a system and a process, and we've got a mainstream and etc. And oceans and acres, flora and fauna of literature show that that's actually quite a difficult thing to do. So for regulatory innovation, it's not as simple as just being a startup, because you've got to do it within context of a regulator that has to account for its budget, that has to be called to account to its legislature on a regular basis, that anything goes wrong, it's going to be pilloried in the press, the day it happens, where all the pressures are to be risk averse for all of those different reasons. And so that's why, to be honest, there needs to be a bit of safety in numbers. So actually having a body like the OECD or other cohorts, so everybody can come together and have sort of mass therapy session. No, learning best practice, sorry. Sharing would be really quite helpful.
Thank you, Julia. And you were talking about startup, and I think it's sadly time to finish. I'm very conscious that you're giving us your time, UK time, very late. So I'm going to be cheeky, if I may. Final question too for Wow. First of all, you're obviously at the top of your profession. Who do you see to sort of look out for coming through the ranks, following you, in relation to these regulatory areas? And the other thing is, and I appreciate it's late at night at the moment. What keeps you up late at night in terms of the top challenge, the single top challenge, if you had to choose one in regulation today?
Oh, listen. So in terms of coming through, it's just fantastic because it's now such a vibrant field.
Yeah.
When if I think back, and it is only 20 odd years, the people really writing about regulation in the way that we would think about it now and are talking about it now were, there might have been a dozen of us around the world, and that was probably about it, and they were mainly based in ANU and and the LSE really. a couple in Oxford or given Oxford or something. But no, I mean it was a few scattered around. So now, there's whole substreams and there's whole subfields of regulatory governance studies, and there are people who are focusing on intermediaries over here or trust over there or non-state regulators over here, and so there's just there is just a wealth out there actually of insights. There's more people do more empirical work, more theoretical work, then there's just there's a great richness there really, I think, to draw on. It's just fantastic to see. In terms of what keeps me awake at night, I think what I appreciate more now than I did before, I think what keeps me awake at night, I'm just preoccupied with disasters now. Some disasters. Yeah. So it is on the what could go wrong, and it's thinking through the sort of and this absolutely plays into the climate emergency that we're in. It plays into AI. It's thinking about those severe but plausible scenarios of actually what really could happen and how well positioned is our regulation, or is our economy, or is our society for its resilience to those risks. So and it is actually now not so much about compliance. The things I'm worried about is absolutely much more about risk and resilience.
Yeah, and I think that's a place to reflect on where we ended. Professor Julia Black, that was a special treat. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you. Great pleasure.